It is my real pleasure to welcome everybody here today for the Dean's Lecture Series. I am Erin McNamara Horvat. I'm the Interim Dean of the School of Education, and it is a delight to be with you this morning and a delight to be able to welcome our guest, Elizabeth Grant. Elizabeth is the Chief Program Officer for the National Liberty Museum in Philadelphia. She's the executive there responsible for strategic planning, institutional planning, oversight of exhibitions, education, public programs. And as we noted before everybody came in the room, the museum has a program called the Young Heroes Outreach Program that works with schools on civic engagement. So there's a good bit of overlap between some of the activities, certainly at the museum, and our perspective here at Drexel with our commitment to civic engagement. Today, Dr. Grant is going to be talking more about collections in the museum and the management of those collections, and I suspect linking that to education. Dr. Grant has 20 years experience in collections-based education, which is something that we're thinking a lot about here at Drexel as our collections keep expanding and how we can use those collections in our educational mission. Dr. Grant led departments for museums and archives in the United States and Britain, including the New York Historical Society, the Royal Institute of British Architects, and the Museum of the American Revolution. She holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of Birmingham in the UK, and is published at the intersection of race, place, and memory in post-industrial cities. So I am looking forward to this talk very much as we think about collections and education in this post-industrial city. Dr. Grant.
Thank you so much. First of all, I just want to say how honored and really delighted I am to be here with all of you today. Thank you so much for taking the time to stop in and join us virtually. Before we let everybody into the room, we were just talking about how the fall can just go by like that. So I know you're balancing competing priorities. So thank you for spending the time with me here this morning. My talk, as I'll say in a few minutes, is really going to focus broadly on museum education and then sort of whittling down to talk about what we do at the National Liberty Museum. And it is, of course, an exciting time to think about that at Drexel. So I hope that our time together is worthwhile and gives you some food for thought. So just to explain, I picked the piece on this cover slide because I think it's beautiful, but it also carries a powerful message about museums. It's by artist Michaela Amato, and it featured in the National Liberty Museum's 2020 exhibition, Philly's Freedom. It's part of a series of neon pieces by the artist that are, in her own words, private lamentations or cries for social justice. So, we'll kind of come back to that question of what role do museums play in social change and in channeling that change. But for now, we'll just start off by saying hello. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and what we're going to cover today. So that's me there in the stripes, leading a large group version of the exquisite corpse game, which you may have played. I know we played a lot of it in my house during the lockdown phase. It's when one person starts a drawing, folds it, passes it to someone else, and it goes around, and you end up with this exquisitely odd drawing. This was taken many years ago, as you can probably tell by the bateau stripes, but this was part of a program at the Royal Institute of British Architects called Architecture Drawing Day, which is part of a larger festival called the Big Draw. And the idea was to inspire reflection and get people looking at and thinking about the built environment and architecture in new ways, just through the simple act of drawing. So this is the kind of thing that I love to do, creating and leading education programs and exhibitions and learning experiences that see artifacts as jumping off points for deeper learning and engagement, creating the kinds of sticky moments that resonate for folks long after they visit the museum and long after their program ends. So as you've heard, I'm currently the Chief Program Officer at the National Liberty Museum, where I'm responsible for institutional planning for exhibitions and education. But I've been working in museums and collections for about 20 years, and I really, really love it. I'm so privileged to have been in the presence of just some of the most amazing scholars, and people, but really it's the objects. I love the objects. So I've seen original drawings by 16th century Renaissance architects. I've seen a copy of been close to a copy of the Louisiana Purchase signed by Jefferson and Napoleon. And I will tell you, there's a Madeira stain on it. So, let that kind of sink in. I love old things. I think that they come from the past and can tell us the most amazing stories about people from another time, but also about ourselves. So I've created and delivered exhibitions for programs, exhibitions and programs for hundreds of thousands of people over time, and really do believe that museums have a really important role to play, even today, in helping us understand ourselves and our communities and the world around us. So what we're going to cover today is kind of a little bit about just, the basics, or the sort of overview of museum education and what that is and what learning in museums is. And then I'm going to kind of take you on a walk through some of the highlights from the past 20 years and what I learned at different institutions and how that kind of shapes what I do today. And then we'll look at some of the I think are some of the more exciting conversations that are happening within the field today. So all of that should take up time, but still leave an opportunity for questions towards the end. Of course, if there are any that, if I stumble over something or move too fast, already have my second cup of coffee, please just let me know and I can clarify. So what is museum education anyway? Quite simply, museum education is interpretation. It's the practice of using the museum's tools, and that can include collections, exhibitions, our knowledge base, to engage visitors and enhance the overall museum learning experience. As a practice, museum education includes a range of pedagogical approaches designed to inspire analysis, critical thinking, and reflection. And it's often used kind of interchangeably with words like learning or interpretation. I don't really like wordy slides, as you'll see, but I wanted to include this because I think it's important to note that, of course, there are standards for education and interpretation, and these are defined by our professional body, the American Alliance of Museums. So you can look at these in your own time, but just to sum up, good practice in museum education and interpretation calls for clear articulation of the institution's educational mission, its philosophy, and its core messages for staff and visitors. It calls for a deep understanding of audiences' needs and what they are looking to gain from their experience and engagement from the museum. It calls for high standards of practice in all areas, including research and scholarship. And it calls for ongoing and effective evaluation, of course, to make sure that you are doing all of the above to the best of your ability. So there are a range of jobs within museum education. You've certainly met a museum educator. We give tours, we answer questions in the galleries, lead programs for school groups. And we have different titles, sit in different departments. Can be an educator, a facilitator, a docent, an education curator, a learning officer. It really varies. And there's a sort of broadening nomenclature within the field that kind of marks that expansion of education as a formal practice, focusing on sort of maybe K-12 education, to a more kind of broader understanding of the informal learning that happens in museums. So generally, you see museum education break down into kind of three core areas. Most notably, and probably most recognizable, is our work with schools and the focus on formal learning in pre-K to 12 education. So educators who work in this space generally have an understanding of formal classroom learning pedagogies. Many are former teachers or pre-service teachers. They often come with specialist knowledge in a subject area, such as art, history, or science, and they have a strong grasp of curriculum and standards for that subject matter. They actively build and maintain relationships with teachers and administrators, often in the form of teacher advisory groups, but in all kinds of other ways, just through regular programming, providing educator resources and things like that. And of course, they offer those field trips and after school opportunities and other student-focused programs. Public programs for adults can include all the things you can think of, the talks, tours, performances, and so much more. Specialists in this area often have a strong understanding of both formal and informal learning practices, but they generally come with skills in event management and production, partnership building, outreach, as well as kind of like those other sort of adjacent areas of marketing and communication, because these programs tend to be one of the biggest flares that a museum can put up about itself in sort of its statement of purpose and who they are. And then for families, museum education really focuses on accessibility and sort of building those relationships with families, knowing that children who visit museums with their families tend to have a lifelong relationship with museums. We also really encourage intergenerational learning, knowing that that enhances the experience for younger visitors and their grown-ups, and generally increases the likelihood that the learning is going to continue at home post-visit if the learning happened together. So if you ever find yourself in a museum and sitting on the sidelines of family activity, you're going to get pulled in. So just to note that many museum educators can work nimbly across all of these areas, particularly if they are working in a small museum. No matter their area of focus, museum educators employ similar learning strategies to activate learners' critical faculties. I have some examples here. First, object-based learning is a form of active learning that uses artworks and artifacts, archival materials, digital representations of any of those to inspire close observation and deep critical thinking. This can take many different forms, a facilitated dialogue or self-directed tours, scavenger hunts, discovery trails, but really kind of calling on the visitor to observe, analyze, and learn from the object themselves. This image here, this is from a program we did on gourd banjos at the Museum of the American Revolution, and we had a fantastic display of gourd banjos for people to touch and handle. Obviously, you can't do that with all historical artifacts. These were reproductions. Object-based learning is a form of inquiry-led learning, a learning process that engages learners by encouraging real-world connections through exploration and high-level reasoning. It's an approach that really encourages students to engage in kind of that problem-solving and experiential learning, and the focus is really on kind of how to think, embedding a sort of understanding and an ability to sort of practice certain skills and recognize those as you're practicing them rather than in what to think. And then there are subject-specific practices. So different disciplines use different approaches. Art museums, for example, employ visual thinking strategies, or VTS, which are a slow-looking method. This is a slow-looking method that asks visitors to take time to really look and talk about what they see through observation and discussion, so that learners really develop their skills in critical thinking, visual literacy, communication, and collaboration. As I said, this is largely employed in art museums, sometimes history museums as well, looking at artifacts, but it's just one in a whole range of subject-specific methods that encourage exploration and discovery. So that can include kind of creative or design thinking practices, project-based learning, or STEM-related methods, and things like that, depending on the area of focus. So, as I said, educators educate the public through historical artifacts and artwork. This does sound an awful lot like what curators do to a certain extent, and there is sometimes some overlap. Curators are stewards of a museum's objects, of its collection, and the knowledge base that exists around those objects. They lead the team that care and preserve for the collection, but they also are the advocates for the collection, the voice of the collection, the sort of representatives. And in that, they often take a public role, obviously in shaping exhibitions, but also in speaking directly to the public, providing research and giving tours and things like that. So we're in the same universe, and we intersect a lot, and we see that between museum education and exhibitions. We collaborate. Curators advocate for the subject and the collection, and educators essentially are audience advocates. But together they unlock the stories that objects can tell through knowledge about the objects themselves, and in facilitating programs, and through what we learn through all of that process. And so this is where I think it gets really interesting. Over the past 3 decades or so, there's been a growing body of research dedicated to the learning science behind museums, and specifically free choice learning, that has explored and informed museum practices from conception to design to visitor experience and education. So what does that look like in practice? So essentially moving away from this hierarchical top-down model in which the curator, via the selection, arrangement, and labeling of an object or objects, imparts knowledge to the visitor, museums focus increasingly on how visitors engage in meaning making through their entire museum experience, how they bring their own subjectivity and existing knowledge to bear on every element of their visit, from the minute they encounter the museum on the internet or on a poster on the side of a bus, to their first steps in the door, and even in their interactions in the cafe, the gift shop, the bathroom stall. All of these are sites of potential learning and engagement with the visitor. Importantly, and for me, probably even more interesting, is that the journey also provides opportunities at all stages for the visitor to make meaning either independently or together with their family or friend that they're traveling with, or just with the wider community that takes shape within a museum. And that creates a shared body of knowledge. So museum interactives are spaces that create opportunities for visitors to engage with each other, or involved directly in solving a problem or sharing personal reflections. These all create opportunities for collective meaning making. So that can include talkback walls, such as the ones above, or in which visitors respond directly to a prompt and to each other. You can see kind of some of those from recent exhibitions, or in even bigger projects like co-curated exhibitions or participatory programs. So just going back to those kind of codes and standards that I shared at the beginning, you can sort of, some of the ways in which museum education kind of puts those into practice in the visitor-centered museum sort of come to light. So for example, an education team quite often is responsible for defining and establishing the theory of practice and measuring program impact and success against that theory, that theory of change. And ensuring that it's kind of robust or evolves if it needs to. Education teams are often sort of do that relationship building work with different constituencies and audiences, and ensuring that we understand and are meeting their needs. high standards of practice. Of course, as I said earlier, we come with specialist knowledge quite often. And we also know who to call on when we don't know what we need to know, right? We sort of have that network of scholars and community within the museum and beyond. And then evaluation is important, not just in how are we doing? That's of course important, but more it's sort of taking that information about how we're doing, both quantitative and qualitative, and feeding it back into the system that creates the exhibitions and the programs and the marketing and the communications, right? We're sort of feeding the engine through all of our programs and activities. Right. So with that, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what I do. I don't usually break artifacts. That's actually a reproduction, but it was for the Family Discovery Center at the Museum of the American Revolution, and we were breaking pots to put in one of the displays. So I work here. This is the National Liberty Museum, which is a small concept museum in Old City, Philadelphia. I hope you have heard of us and maybe have visited. We are in the heart of the historic district, about a block away from the Liberty Bell. Through 4 exhibitions a year and a dynamic lineup of programs and events, the NLM offers a contemporary perspective on one of the most fundamental historic ideals. So my responsibilities within that include strategy and long-term planning for the areas of exhibitions and learning and public engagement, content development, execution and evaluation, so much project management, team management, fundraising, of course, all of those elements. That's what I do on a daily basis. As I said, museums are highly collaborative spaces, and every element of that work involves intersecting and overlapping project teams that pull representatives from different areas and specialisms together to push the work forward. There's constant motion because there's always an exhibition, there's always another program. It seems like the school year is always starting. I'm sure you can relate. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of work. Before I go further, I thought I could provide a little insight on why and how I ended up here in the first place. This time, that's not me. That's not my museum, but we love dinosaurs. So that's me. I love history. I grew up reading every historical biography I could get my hands on, and I had 2 parents who thought a great day out was going to Independence Hall. And I will say that this was a day of hooky. My mom took me out of school to go to Old City and take a look around. I was the first person to go to college, and as an undergraduate at Trinity College in Connecticut, I dabbled in English and history before settling in the American Studies department, where in a sophomore theory class, Professor Jan Cohn kind of changed my life with this one object here. It wasn't actually this one, because you can't find a Pocahontas themed child's bathing suit from 1997 on the internet, but it was, with the sort of style, the fringe, the turquoise accents. I think you kind of get where I'm going here. So our professor put this on the table, and we spent an hour talking about it. Who made it, where, why, what can we learn about it from its style, the way it looks, it feels. I was hooked. I was fascinated by this conversation and what came from it. So as my undergraduate program was really largely influenced by the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, based at the University of Birmingham in the UK, which introduced new approaches in understanding the meanings and values of cultural texts. I assume some of you are familiar with this in at least the broader sense, so forgive me if I'm sharing things and argued that mass media in all forms, including this bathing suit, are worthy of study as a means of understanding structural forms of power. It's largely influenced by post-Marxist theory, The Birmingham School undertook research into cultural politics and the way identities and subjectivity are developed, reformed, and lived. So as I finished my undergraduate degree and looked to graduate programs, I found myself at the University of Birmingham in the American and Canadian Studies Department, focusing on the intersection of race, place, and identity, particularly, as you heard, in post-industrial urban spaces. So as I finished my doctoral dissertation, I took a part-time role as the education coordinator of a small oral history archive in Wolverhampton, England. The archive was maintained by a very small community-based nonprofit that had collected the interviews as a sort of part of a nationwide celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Empire Windrush, the first wave of post-war migration from the British Commonwealth to England. And my job was kind of take that oral history archive and produce 6 online learning resources for use in primary and secondary school classrooms. I was hooked again. So as I finished my PhD and started to look to the next thing, I knew that I wanted to work with collections. I wanted to focus on education in some way, and I wanted to do this kind of project-based work. Admittedly, I was a little weary of the 4-year dissertation or however long it took, I don't remember, but I wanted to kind of work in that environment of kind of constant motion. So at 26, I decided that I wanted to work in museums, which you know, it took me a minute. Some people decide really early on, but that's how I ended up here. So after completing my PhD, I was really fortunate to find a position at the New York Historical Society in the education team. If you aren't familiar, NYHS is the oldest museum in New York, and it's the second oldest in the nation. It has over 4 million objects spanning over 400 years of history. And it truly is a repository of kind of national significance, despite having just New York in its name. So when I arrived, it was going through the really early stages of a significant transformation. It had some sort of troubles for over a series of decades, but now with new leadership and with the blockbuster exhibition on Alexander Hamilton recently under its belt. This was before the musical, I feel like I should note. The museum was about to embark on its next big project, which is a multi-year programmatic initiative focused on slavery in New York. So over 3 years, I'm sorry, this picture is so pixelated. It's hard to find a digital impression of it these days. But this initiative lasted for 3 years and included 3 major exhibitions, as well as art installations and educational programs. And through this initiative, NYHS really kind of raised the practice of slavery in New York and in the North more broadly into the public consciousness in new ways. So we welcomed tens of thousands of students to the museum and led countless professional development programs in that time. In my role, I was really focused on content. I just finished my degree. I kind of came in to work with teachers. This was new material for so many of them. And through the exhibition and accompanying educator resource guide, we were able to bring this new scholarship for them into the classroom and lessons and activities that were created and designed by teachers with the support from the exhibition's curatorial team and researchers. This was the foundation for everything that kind of came in my career afterwards. And I took lessons from it that I'm going to share today. And the first is that teachers are everything. I spent so much of my time connecting with teachers and learning about what they do. As you've heard, I don't have an education degree. And it was so eye-opening and informative and provided a real crash course in curriculum standards and practices. This was the heyday of federal Teaching American History grants, and we partnered on at least a dozen in my time at the Historical Society. The purpose of this grant was to connect scholars and scholarship to the classroom, and I was just so privileged to work with so many amazing historians and lead teachers and really build up a network of museum education professionals from across the country. that I'm still connected to today. Through that work, it was so clear how hungry teachers were, as I said, for this content. Many did not have history backgrounds. Many did not even have social studies backgrounds or specialisms. So it really was invaluable to kind of have this access. I learned new thinking, or I don't know, I learned new names for thinking and practices, you know, the historical thinking skills, project-based learning. These are things that I had sort of understood and developed, you know, as a postgraduate, but now to put them to work in classrooms was really exciting. And I learned the importance of policy and advocacy. I mean, these grants, they went away. That work is missing now, you know, like I think that kind of, that stays with me as well, particularly at this time. And lastly, I'll just note, NYHS was an institution in transition. I was part of a big change project, and that in itself brought lessons that I still employ today. So the next move was back to London, where I kind of left the sort of formal history world behind me and moved into the world of design. So I took a role as the education curator at the Royal Institute of British Architects. The RIBA is the professional body of architects in the UK, and it oversees standards in education and training for over 40,000 members and 200,000 members worldwide. The collections is one of the largest and arguably could be seen as one of the most important architectural collections in the world. And my job was to create programs and exhibitions for students of architecture and design. But I saw a really good opportunity to bring together the assets of the RIBA, which are the members and everything that they do, and its collections together in a rich learning program that informs and inspires the public to understand the built environment. So over the years, I worked alongside architects to design and implement learning programs for all ages. First starting with schools in sort of informal learning programs and holiday workshops. Sorry, not schools, starting with young children from 7 up. In these sort of informal learning workshops, and then introducing free family days, and eventually a national school program that connected architects and teachers in creative partnerships. They would kind of rely on the collections for inspiration and information, and then they would sort of create the most amazing projects in their own classrooms and in their own communities. In 8 years and with just an amazing team, we increased participation per year from 400 to 10,000 nationally. And all of these programs kind of infused creative and design thinking approaches and created these wonderful opportunities for learning by doing, which I hope you can kind of see in the images here. We also built momentum for a really exciting project. And again, I apologize for the pixelation on this one, to design a new learning studio at the RIBA's headquarters. So with years of advocacy and profile building, we were able to secure a grant from the Clore Duffield Foundation. And with this funding, we launched a competition to design this new space. And this is the end result. Or just a piece, anyway. So from there, I came back to the United States and took a job as director of education at the Museum of the American Revolution. I arrived just as the museum was about to celebrate its first anniversary, and moving from established and you could say sometimes a little creaky institutions to a brand new museum was just so exciting. And not just because we had offices, which sometimes are hard to come by in historic buildings, but really, you know, the opportunity and the potential and the need was just fantastic. So as I came on board, I was really responsible for kind of taking stock of where the education program was and developing a strategic plan for where we wanted to be. So together with my team, we were able to take the time to kind of really hone in and articulate an educational mission and theory of change, in some ways unburdened by decades, centuries of history, and really kind of articulate that for the future. We introduced new programs for families, was a core audience, new opportunities for educators, including summer teacher institutes and teacher professional development programs, and really focused on audience development. The American Revolution is complex, and its brand, for lack of a better term, maybe, is confusing, sometimes could be even divisive. So the museum's mission is to share the many dimensions of a story we think we know, and programming seeks to bring these new stories to the forefront. So one of my greatest accomplishments there was the launch of the Citizenship Initiative, which is a free program that prepares immigrants for the citizenship test. And that's the first cohort of graduates there in the upper right. And my daughter asked me to tell you that that's her in the bottom left, making some sculpture. So here we are. That was my journey to where I am today. In 2020, I packed my things literally on a cart, and I rolled them across the street to set off on this new adventure. I had not anticipated making this move from where I was, but it was just an exciting opportunity to be part of an organization that was on the precipice of so much change. That was something I had learned over the years was really important to me. I like big projects. I like future planning and visioning, and the National Liberty Museum is undergoing such a significant transformation. I wanted to be part of that. So we are currently in the midst of a 3-year transitional strategic plan that has 3 core elements. The first is a leadership transition. We have a new chief executive as of earlier this year. This is the first non-family member to head up the organization. The museum was founded and maintained with leadership within the same family for over 2 decades. So this is a big change and an exciting one for the future. We are launching a strategic interpretive plan. We're working with a New York City-based design firm to really kind of hone in on and define and develop the language for how we talk about and explain and think about liberty. We're also kind of doing all of this work with an eye to completely reimagining the museum. So capital changes with improvements across the building, but also new galleries and design spaces in the future. We're not kind of waiting for that to happen, though. We are sort of doing some of the infrastructure work. So it quite literally is all change at the museum, it feels sometimes. So as we set out to develop a programming strategy for this time, we continually came back to this idea of deconstructing and reconstructing liberty, knowing that our subject and the word liberty itself carries a mixed bag of historical and cultural and social significance, and that from the very top down, outside in, we were reimagining this museum. This notion of deconstructing and reconstructing really kind of stuck. So beginning in 2020, we launched a series of annual changing exhibition programs, up to 4 in 1 year. And through that, we employed a variety of different methods in exhibition design and development and programming that I want to kind of explore with you a little bit as you think about the role that museums can play. Since 2020, within that changing exhibition programs, we've produced 4 call to artist shows that have featured the artwork of upwards of 200 artists coming from across the country and even internationally. And we'll say that we have our next show opening in January, and we had submissions from all around the globe, which is just so exciting. The first of these, Philly's Freedom, we issued the call to artists in February 2020. I say we, I hadn't arrived yet, but this call to artists went out even before the pandemic, the social justice movements and civil rights movements of 2020. None of that was I mean, maybe we could say it was on the horizon for sure, but this wasn't happening yet. So we were collecting material, we were collecting reflections on this idea of freedom throughout that time period. And when we opened in 2020, the exhibition offered reflections on police brutality and Black Lives Matter, on the pandemic, on political polarization. It offered messages of hope, calls for peace through justice, and collaboration. Like so many museums, we learned to exist in the virtual sphere, and we were able to bring this exhibition to new audiences, to people wherever they were, through our virtual museum and through programs like this. I can't overstate the value of being able to share this exhibition with the schools that we worked with that year. So many of them would say on a Zoom call, "This is my first visit to a museum." Did not matter, it was in Zoom. But to kind of see this exhibition and to sort of have the world that they see every day kind of reflected back at them and sort of give them an opportunity to talk about some of these things was really, really valuable. This exhibition, I should note, it lives on in a virtual experience in a website, so you can visit and explore the exhibition at any time. Next, we have engaged in a number of co-curated and collaborative exhibitions that have really been critical to our Changing Exhibition program and in exploring that concept of liberty. This exhibition, Craftivism, Activism Through Craft, opened in 2021 and featured three installations by artist and activist Shannon Downey. At the center of this was Exodus. This is on the bottom left. Exodus was Shannon Downey's hand-stitched letter to the Catholic Church, explaining why she was renunciating her faith. This was very pivotal to her and sort of her exploration of this idea of liberation. It served as a jumping off point for a number of different talks and conversations, including public programs with Kari Williams there, who talked about sort of the process of her work as an activist, but also sort of what that different ways one can engage in sort of changing the world. And we also featured this installation by Nicole Nikolish, who's a fiber artist based here in Philadelphia. Her installation on our replica Liberty Bell celebrated the revolutionary history of the Liberty Bell as a symbol of the abolitionist and suffrage movements. And it served as a reminder that the work of liberty is the work of extending liberty to all. Another collaboration that offered us kind of significant insights was with Taller Puerto Riqueño, a community space in North Philadelphia dedicated to celebrating and preserving Puerto Rican and Latin heritage. Together, we produced a solo show featuring the artwork of artist and educator and co-founder of Taller, Johnny Irizarry. The resulting exhibition, La Brega, Art for Reimagining the World, explored this idea of La Brega, or the struggle, and through pieces that reflect on colonialism and its legacies. This was Johnny's first solo show, and there he is in the bottom right at the opening and conversation with artist Roberto Lugo. And we were just, he's an amazing individual, and to sort of see the response that the people had in wanting to just celebrate and honor his life was really moving. We continued to collaborate with Taller throughout the run of the exhibition and producing a range of different programs, including bilingual school tours, bilingual tours for school groups. So the last exhibition I'll look at today is Truth, which opened in September 2022. Truth is a conceptual show that explores the meaning and significance of truth in our age of hypercommunication. For this exhibition, we created a panel of advisors comprised of artists, voting rights advocates and watchdogs, legal scholars, historians and philosophers. It sounds like the beginning of a joke, like they all walk into a room and start talking about truth. That's what we had to do. And it really helped us understand what, the very idea of truth means in all these different contexts and why it seems so central to today's discourse and polarization. So the asterisk in the title treatment is really important. It reminds us that there is more to truth than meets the eye. The exhibition takes a deep dive into how we perceive and construct truth on personal and societal levels, and then it takes a three-dimensional walk on different pathways to truth through science, philosophy, religion, or history. And it reflects on the impact rapid advancements in communication technology have had, both in a proliferation of shared knowledge and innovations, but also in an erosion of trust in our institutions and each other. The exhibition provides real moments of reflection in a series of accompanying art installations that you can see there, and opportunities to put new ideas and knowledge to the test in interactive experiences, such as our pop-up truth booth that you can see there. So I just want to highlight some of the things that we've learned along the way that we can, and it benefits us and our subject to be nimble and responsive to the world around us. The stories that we share can be very powerful, but they're most powerful when people are given the opportunity to tell their own stories and in their own voices. That liberty is best understood through action and hands-on opportunities to make, create, and reflect. And that most importantly, and certainly definitely the most challengingly, and I'm not sure we've cracked this nut entirely yet, is that we can and should and have to make space for difficult conversations across different perspectives. And in doing so, we can begin to build an appreciation of liberty, not just as a right, but as a responsibility to the rights of others. So I want to spend, we're coming to the final stretch here, and I just wanted to touch on some of the sort of prevailing or dominant questions and issues within the museum field today that kind of intersect across different areas, but certainly in our work in education. So first, and for this, I have just ripped from the headlines. This is what's around us. To sort of think about what we're seeing everywhere. So questions of trust that arise in this moment of hypercommunication. It's certainly something we talk about in truth, but we feel it in our work every day too. But nonetheless, studies have indicated that museums remain one of the most trusted sources for information. That trust, importantly, is kind of rooted for many in the idea that museums are inherently fact-driven and non-ideological institutions. We see that that doesn't always line up when some of those facts perhaps don't meet what people perceive in the world. So the neutral status of museums is certainly an active conversation within our field. How do we maintain that level of trust while still doing good service to our collections and the work that we do and our audiences and our constituents? Our work, research, analysis, interpretation, that allows for multi-dimensional, nuanced perspectives of the world and a deeper understanding and appreciation in some ways of humanity in all of its strengths and failings. So all of our activities, education, exhibitions, they're all, like everything, going to exist under the microscope of today's culture wars. Certainly the Young Heroes Outreach Program, our longest running education program, employs social emotional learning and action civics. These are increasingly becoming words that we're seeing in school board conversations. That's there. So what can we do? Well, we're aligning with each other to affirming standards of practice and doing our best to educate others about the power of art, scientific method, historical inquiry, and so on. The focus on museum neutrality certainly comes not just from outside, but also from within the institution itself, as we seek to undo historical structures of colonization and subjugation. Museums are, after all, Enlightenment projects, and museums themselves are filled with material that comes from a period of colonization, as this recent John Oliver clip articulated. Efforts at understanding what is in collections, but what isn't, how the collections took shape, for what purpose and why, what stories are not represented, how these collections reinforced power structures. These are all questions that we're asking. But increasingly, as I've tried to show, putting communities and sort of breaking down the barriers around the institution and allowing people to do the work and meeting making and placemaking themselves and share their own stories is one way in which we can sort of start to rethink some of our collections and what they mean. And then, of course, there are so many prevailing conversations in our times, conversations about labor, workers' rights, the influence of corporations, particularly tied to fossil fuels and other things, what that means for our future, accessibility and inclusion. These are all woven into our work today. In many ways, what happens here remains to be seen, but museums' ties to corporations and personal wealth and influence, they're certainly on people's minds. So I have so many thoughts on those issues, no specific answers yet, but I do know that they will continue to shape and drive our work in exhibitions, education, and in all areas. And I really am hopeful that we're going to emerge in a better place. As I said at the beginning, I strongly believe in the power of museums to help us understand our place in the world around us, to bring us together. How we do that may and will continue to change, but I will hold hope that museums are the spectacle of the invisible. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. Really appreciate it. Fascinating and highly relevant presentation. It was really wonderful to hear about your career trajectory and how you got where you are, and especially as we think about museum education here at Drexel. I was scribbling down all sorts of questions that I wanted to ask, but I will defer to the audience and see if others would want to have questions that they would want to ask, especially our students. Well, given that, then I get to ask the first question, which is not actually very well formed, but I'm curious about how you think about the work that you've done over all of these years, the work that you're doing now at the museum and its relationship to specifically public schools, to Philadelphia School District. I raised two daughters as a parent in the city and spent all kinds of time in the Inside Out exhibit and the Academy of Natural Sciences, and among others, I mean, just all over the place. It was such a big part of my daughters' lives. And yet sometimes there seems to be this kind of real disconnect between what happens in these amazing educational spaces and students' lived experience in schools. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on that. Before I let you answer, though, I have to say Johnny Irizarry was a student of mine at Temple about 15, 20 years ago. He got his master's degree from Temple Urban Education. And so it's wonderful to see what he's been up to. So
I love that.
Yeah.
That warms my heart. I'm so honored to have spent time with him. So.
Yeah, he's an amazing guy. Yep.
So in answer to your first question, that's a great question. And I think that is, fundamentally the work that we try to do kind of constantly, right, is break down those walls and those barriers to the institution. School programs is the #1 way that you're going to be able to do that. Obviously, it's complicated, right? That doesn't mean a lifelong lasting relationship between visiting students and museums, but one thing that we endeavor to do is to make museums accessible, approachable, and comfortable spaces for students, a space where they feel that they belong. Content matters, but also so many other things. How students enter the museum, where they, is it via the back door? Is it the front door? Is it like, there's all kinds of things, right, that go.
Yeah, that issue of belonging is like something we're thinking about centrally here at Drexel. And it's interesting to hear you talk about it from a museum perspective. I'm going to have to pass the baton perhaps to Sarah Ulrich. I have a hard stop at 11 o'clock, unfortunately, but I don't want to stop the conversation. So I'm going to to pass that on, and thank you so much for coming and sharing your journey and your current work with us. So sorry to interrupt.
No problem.
Yep.
I can just add one more thing about that in response to that question, because I do think our educational programs are unique. The core of our program is the Young Heroes program that works in partnership with schools. So, you know, the museum kind of serves as the facilitator, of a program that is really developed and led by students and their teachers themselves. It's a year-long program, a project-based learning program that introduces civic knowledge and skills, and then invites students to kind of identify an issue that they would like to change in their communities, and then they implement and deliver the project. That happens 90% outside of the museum. But it's taking sort of the content, the principles that we employ in our learning program, and embedding them in the classroom. This is very similar to the work I did at the RIBA, you know, sort of thinking about the museum as a resource, not always just a place.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Grant. Did others have questions?
Actually, Sarah, I had a sort of a question.
Okay.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. I agree with Erin. Your career trajectory was really interesting, and what you're doing at the Liberty Museum seems not only interesting, but important. But what I wanted to say also was that we actually have a few projects going on in the School of Ed that you might be interested in, some research ones, both one related to your experience with RIBA. We're doing some things with the AIA here, but also on civic education. We have a kind of a research team that we're working on, and I would love to connect with you at some point if there's a way to find your email address or something. But yeah, so I just wanted to bring that up in case that wasn't something you were familiar with.
I certainly know of the civic education work at Drexel, but I want to talk more, and I think there's an interesting connection to be made between design thinking and civic education. So I'd love to kind of bring that together if we can. So yes, I will find your information and we will talk.
Okay, great, thanks.
We can definitely connect you. I believe Dr. DeCarlo has a question in the chat.
How is it different working in a museum that is about, oh gosh. Yeah, that is a really good question. That is a challenge, and that's partially why we are going through this interpretive planning process. To work with a concept, especially a concept like liberty, concepts are just essentially concepts, right? They're slippery. You can't hold on to them, they change. So I think what we want to and are moving towards is a museum that is maybe always constantly evolving and changing with that concept, and is kind of the vision of a collaborative, right? The National Liberty Museum was the vision, if you know our history, of really of one individual. He created this, our museum. He built the collection. It was his vision. And now we want this to be a collaborative, dynamic, changing vision, because liberty is a collaborative effort. Our museum should perhaps be as well. So it certainly presents challenges. We can't work in sort of the very traditional way of museums of knowing you have a body of stuff and then you're going to work from that stuff. But it also presents some really great opportunities to explore a subject such as ours.
Thank you. Other questions? I know we're over time here a little bit. Any last questions?
I mean, I can ask, I feel like everyone else, like I don't have a well-formed question. I thank you for sharing like your trajectory and how it's informed your work today, and that's really great. One of the things like I was thinking a lot about, particularly early in your presentation, was like the goal of fostering and responding to people's curiosity.
Mhm.
And just thinking through like how that looks different than it may have like 30 years ago in the
Yeah.
museum space. And then also, like, what does that mean for if you're prepping a class to come work with you? Like, what would you do to work with a teacher so that like there might be some pre-work? I know often with museums, there's like some pre-work around,
Mhm.
this is what we're going to do at the museum, and this is what we might want to think about before we go there. And how does that look?
Yeah, I mean, I think
yeah.
there are lots of ways that museum spaces have kind of changed over time. Like, I mean, certainly there are a lot more bells and whistles, right, that sort of respond to or kind of invite that kind of curiosity. They're, you know, moving away from kind of like simple space, like things on the walls, to creating immersive spaces and, you know, talk back reflection spaces, all these kinds of things, like building programming into the space rather than thinking about it as being separate. So that's kind of, you see that in different design elements that we're probably much more familiar with, but it's kind of taken, you know, time for the kind of for this to like become the norm rather than the innovation. And then in terms of prepping students for visit, it really depends. Certainly for when I think about my work at the Museum of the American Revolution, you know, one of the biggest things we had to prepare them for was the space, right? It's a huge museum that is very crowded with people, with objects, and like that they're going to go on this this kind of story walk in a way, looking at objects and learning different things. For the Liberty Museum, we kind of have to prepare them for a conversation, right? Not for a story so much, to be prepared to kind of think about big ideas and big picture things. And then maybe, you know, I think that's kind of like setting that expectation is really important. And then once we get there, we can sort of introduce stories or have them kind of do the focus on an activity that kind of helps them process and put that to work and that kind of thing. But, you know, they're coming for an experience so much more than they are for like the narrative.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Okay, any last thoughts or questions? Thank you again so much for joining us this morning. Thank you for your incredibly interesting talk. Gave us a lot of food for thought with regard to the K-12 population and learning in museum contexts for our pre-service teachers. So really just a wonderful opportunity for us. So thank you so much for being here. We truly, truly appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. And I hope you'll all come visit soon, please.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Good place for co-ops too. We'll talk about that, Elizabeth. All right, thank you.
Yes, we'll talk.
Thanks. And thanks for coming, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.